Ruchim Aboim Hashem Egen Shir Torah. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's shir from Yakov Smith on challenging Tumas Kohanim questions. I'd like to give a big yashikach to Mishpachas Weiss for sponsoring today's shir to the Nishmas Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Chaim HaKohen Zechon Levacha, Isha Rivka Yenta Bas Rabbi Chaim Zechon Levacha, and Abocha Chaim Olav Shalom Hashem Yikim Doma Ben Rosh Anshel HaKohen. Hashem Shmer V'Yatzileu. To have the great zechus of sponsoring a shir, call Egen Shir Torah at 718-851-8651 or email ist@yeshivanet.com. Harold Smith.
Someone recently asked me, he's a bus driver and he drives here in our neighborhoods, and he was told that you can't drive in certain blocks because you pass the street where the Beis HaKvaros is, and there's a tree in the Beis HaKvaros that extends over the street where he drives. I never heard of this. He wanted to know a little more about that. Okay. And that was one question. Another question is regarding an interesting question, a true story, a dentist that had the shayla, where he was told that the certain bone extract that you use in typical implants comes from human remains, and he didn't know anything about that. And I guess the Yisrael that has an implant can't open his mouth if he learns with a Kohen. Another question we had about a Zayda took his grandchild to the museum, and there's no shayla, but he didn't realize that his anicle was a Kohen, although he's a katan, and a museum typically has human remains, as we'll soon see. And I wanted to discuss this sugya because it's a good start, because we think the Tumas Kohanim pertains to Kohanim, and if I'm a Kohen, if I'm a Levi Yisrael, it's not to me. And here you see three shaylas that are all negay and not to Kohanim, but to Yisraelim as well. But the truth is, the whole inyan of Tumas Kohanim is negay to Yisraelim as much as Kohanim in a certain sense. Besides the fact that if a Yisrael causes a Kohen to be mitamei, there's a islif neiva. But it's much more specific than that. The Shach in the beginning of Shin Ayin Aleph, and Magen Avraham Mishtabur and Shin Mem Gimel quotes this as well. Quote the Rekeach, one of the Rishonim in Siman Shin Tezvav, Eishes Kohen Muberes, Muteres Likanes Ba'oyal Hameis. In other words, a woman who is obviously not a Kohen, but she married a Kohen and she's expecting, she's allowed to go to a Levaya, for example. Now we would think, of course, what's the problem? She's not a Kohen and the child wasn't born yet. Zakti Rekeach, the Svek Sveikuhu. It's a double suffix. Shema Neifalu, maybe the child will not survive the birth, so it won't be a Kohen. And even if it does survive, it might be a girl. So the Rekeach has to come on to a het of Svek Sveika. And to us it's a pliya, because the baby is not yet born. What's the problem? More so, even if it is born, it's all of 1 minute old. It's lo yigiyah lechinuch. The mother is not mechuyev because she's not a kohen. But anybody who knows anything knows it's not a kasha. It's a pasuk, it's a gemara, it's Shulchan Aruch in two different places. And that's the very big sugya of the Issa of Safinan. We learned it not long ago in Parshas Emor, the Gemara Darshas Emor v'Amarta, Zog Dimar Yevamas Kuf Yudal Lahazik Doilam Alaktanim, that not only is there an Issa on a Kohen to become Tameh, but there's an Issa on a Yisrael to cause a Kohen to become Tameh. Not just Lifnei Eva, but there's an Issa Derais of Safina. There are 3 psukim as the Gemara discusses, but it's negeh for us. One of the 3 psukim, there's an Issa Derais on a Yisrael to cause a Kohen, even Ben Yoimai, as the Mishtabura and Shin Mem Gimel, Sivkot and Dalit spells out, this Issa of Lahazik Del Aktanam is on a Yisrael, even on a baby Kohen, a 1-day-old. Just like you can't feed a child tarfus, you can't be matama a Kohen, cotton, even lo yigiyah lechinuch. So therefore the Rekeach understandably had to figure out, so why is it mutter to go into the oil of a mace? Maybe she'll have a child that's a zachar, so then you come on to svek sveika. So that's why for a bus driver, who's a Yisrael, to drive children, even if they're lo yigiyah lechinuch, even very young children, if indeed he is entering an oil hameis, being under the same tree, it's a possible nisa deraisa. Of course, we know that Bizman Hazeh, even in Chutz La'aretz, the same Issa of Tumas Kohanim is fully in effect, as the Chinuch writes in Reish Samach Gimel. And even if the Kohen was once Tameh, he attended Levaya of one of his Shiva Kroivim, but the Issa is not being Tameh or not, the Issa is being Metameh. So we have quite a challenge, because as we see in these neighborhoods alone, there are a number of areas in Fort Hamilton Parkway, in the 20th Avenue, in Ocean Parkway and Flatbush, where trees overlap a basic forest on one side, and where pedestrians walk or drive on the other side. Now I'm going to be very clear, I'm going to try not to give details for what's today Negeya, because things change, and our precious listeners that live wherever they live, there are many other questions, other suburban areas particularly. It's a very much a real question, especially in our city where we have 1 million trees, which is nice for the landscaping, but it causes complications about this sugya. So the emes is, the question of course is very simple. Is it true that a tree that's on one side over a beis hakvaros, and the other side where a kohen walks or drives, does that conduct a tumah? So the pashtus is actually two mishnayos in a halachos, Perik Ches, Mishnah Aleph and Beis, where the Mishnah basically gives examples of meviyin, which really basically means the kohen might be at a different place, but there's a conductor that brings a tumah from one side to the other. One of the examples the Mishnah gives is an Ilan shu meisach ala oretz. To put this very clearly, a kohen is living in his house, and he lives under a tree. It's a huge tree. On the other side of the tree, there's a mace. So he says, I'm in my own house, and what do I have to do with the mace? But an Elon conducts Tumah from house to house if there's a Pesach Tefach. But basically, a tree is definitely a conductor of Tumah. The question, of course, is every tree, every branch. There are big branches, there are small branches, there are leaves. So in the Shulchan Aruch, in Yeridei Shin Samach Tes Aleph, is very specific, but very little information. The Kohen has to be careful not to become Tamei Meis. You could have a tree with many branches. In other words, their facts are clear. There are a number of branches, and there's a mace under one of them. It's unknown to the Kohen which branch it is. So the halacha is, the Mechaber says, that the Kohen should not go under these branches, because maybe his mazel, he goes under the one that has the mace. Frek the levush, at most it's a suffix, so why is there a problem? So levush says the understandable response, sveika deraisa l'chumra. You're dealing with it's a chamor of Tumas Kohanim. But pashit, like I told you earlier, if there's a big tree, on one side there's a mace, the other side there's a kohen, and even in his house, if there's a Pesach Tefach, the tree conducts the Tumah. In fact, I once saw a Davar Nifla. Theoretically, a kohen's allowed to go out of, if he's out of the dalaramas of a mace. So why can he go in a base of kvaris and be careful? He'll navigate his way he goes, and he'll stay out of dalaramas of the kvaris. And the answer is but the kvaris have trees. And that spreads the tumah more than he realizes. But the point is that our question about a tree bringing the tumah from the base hakfaris to the kohen outside, pashtus is a beferish mishnah. But the big question is, it's not a big tree. Let's say it's a small tree. Let's say it's a stray branch. Let's say it's only leaves. And basically the question is, midei yoim b'yoimai. But one thing I could tell you, trees are a potential problem. In fact, the Gemara in Bava Basra, Chav Zayin and Beis says that a tree that extends into Rosh Hashanah, you're allowed to cut it down because it's a mazik for the Kohanim walking in the street. Now, of course, don't cut down someone else's tree unless you know that halacha applies to this situation. But no doubt about it, it's a mazik when a tree inhibits the walking of a kohen. So one thing we saw, that under the same branch where there's a mace and a kohen is an issa. That's the prisha. But maybe we could say, from there we'll go a step further. Let's say it is, the mace is under one branch, and the Kohen's under a different branch. Says the Prisha, l'chayr that's mutter. Because the only concern that the Mechaber has, based on the Mishnah and the halachos, is under the same branch. And the Shach and Taz quote that if the mace is under one branch, Kohen under the other, l'chayr it's okay. I say l'chayr, we'll soon see why. But the big question is, wait a minute, but it's one big tree. Why is the Prisha, Shach and Taz mekel? So we might say, well, maybe the Kohen's walking under a stray branch that has no shaykhis to the rest of the tree. In other words, there are some trees that look like one. That's a problem, like the two homes. Let's say you have a tree that's primarily in the basic forest, and a stray branch is extending outward. That might be okay. And the question is, when do we say it's okay? What are the guidelines? So I must tell you, I am not about moifis. Because this sugya is a huge sugya in the Rishonim, learning the Mishnah and the halachos, and there's the different Gemaras in Nazir and other places in Shas about when a tree conducts Tumah. But I'm going to try to give you the klalim, and again, I didn't do justice to the sugya. There's a lot more written, but to try to at least touch upon the major yesodis. There's no doubt about it that once a branch is a tefach, which is 3 inches l'chumra, that conducts Tumah. Now, since I was learning the sugya, I was a little more sensitive, and I went up, I measured some trees, like some trees in our neighborhoods, the huge tree that are here for decades. The average tree, not that the stump is around 3 or 4 feet, but the average branch is approximately a foot and a half. A big, well-grown tree is definitely a tefach. I mean, you're talking about feet, not inches. A small tree that they just planted now in the city, it's barely an inch, the branch itself. But one thing we do know, that a tree that has the branch of a tefach is a tree l'chol hadayis. The question often is when it's not fully grown and there are spaces in between. Do you count the tree as one, or do you look at each branch individually? And that's really what the Prisha is talking about. How about if there are a lot of leaves? So basically, what seems to be the maskana of many poskim is basically that if the tree, it looks like one and it's within a tefach, the branches are within a tefach of each other. And according to many shittas, if you count the leaves, that sort of combines one leaf to the other, that is viewed as a tree, as one. Even though there's usually a tefach open separates it, but there's a special, that's the chiddush of the Mishnah, that the Elon has its own halacha, that since it's interlocking and overlapping, you look up and this branch is over here and the other one on top is a little higher. But if it's perceived as one and there's no discernible place in between, that we treat that tree as one. Now, I know it's easier said than done, because there's a lot more to the sugya, Machlokes Rishonim, Rambam Arayvid, and the Rash, and the Meiri, and the Rashba. But the question really is, can you count the leaves to combine and make the tree one? Because the same Perik Ches and Halachos Mishnah Hay says that vegetative growths, vegetables, loimevian, do not transfer tumah. So if vegetative growth doesn't transfer tumah, why should I worry about leaves? And the emes is there are days that hold that leaves don't count. You ignore the leaves, especially if they're less than a tefach by tefach. Especially if they don't survive the winter. And like the Rambam, that's a very major criterion if it doesn't survive the winter. Typically evergreens do, many leaves don't. And also leaves that flap in the wind, oil. So mitzarecha, there are those that are makel regarding leaves. So you look at the branches, then there's a reason to be makel. But then again, very often the branches are within a tefach one the other. You're not on the same line, but higher and lower, you could see the connection. And that's why you'll notice when you look in the poskim that a full-grown tree, a decent tree, has to be treated l'chumra as one. I'll soon tell you the Ma'amar Kaimis. But what I found very interesting, the Malamed L'Hoyel, that was in the Chuvas Chelik Beis, Kuf Lamed Beis, is critical of the Prisha, and Shach and Taz for that matter. Because they say as if it's a done deal. If you have a stray branch, and the Kohen's Under a different branch, it's fine. Says the Malamed L'Hoyel, it's connected many Mishnayos that a tree is considered one. It must be that the Prisha, Shach, and Taz were talking about, like I told you, a stray branch. The bulk of the tree is in the basic kvaris, and there's a stray branch extending outward that's not connected in any way halachically with the rest of the tree. But the Malamed L'Hoyel says it's misleading because you get the impression that if the Kohen's on the branch A and the basic kvaris is branch B or mace is branch B, it's no problem. It's not true. Because very often the tree is viewed as one. Now, as I told you, there's a lot to say about this, but I'm going to share with you a extremely important tshuva. If a Kohen wants to know, anybody wants to know the sugya, this is a must read. And that is the tshuva's Eison Ezrachi in Siman Zayin. Now, let me give you a little bit of history. The Eison Ezrachi was a Kohen, incidentally, Rabbi Avram Rappaport, who basically has a tshuva that has really 4 parts to it. The Ma'aseh Shehaya Kach, there was another Kohen that became Rav in Lvov. It's a little 401 years ago to be exact. In Shin Pei Aleph, he became Rav in Lvov, and he was a Kohen. Yakov Koppelkatz, his name was, and he looked up and he saw that the place that people go, there are trees that line up from that area to the Beis HaKvaris, and it was a very leisure place to relax. And he realized that the trees are overlapping and interconnecting one to the other. And he saw that's the Mevian Tumah from the Beis HaKvaris to the place that people find very comfortable. So he told his children right away, don't go in that area. And he says, my responsibility as the Rabbi, I have to mention to the people that they shouldn't go here. Well, he met some fierce resistance because the people said, excuse me, before you there was a Rav, the Prisha, rather the same Prisha, incidentally. And he lived here. He was a Kohen, as we know. And he walked here. So I responded, he writes, that maybe in his times it wasn't so overgrown. So maybe it wasn't connected, it wasn't interconnecting. But today I see it. I can't deny the fact that it's one connection. So they said, oh, that means according to you, that house you can't live in? He goes, I was about to say that. Yes. There's no end to Tumas Kohanim if it's legitimate. But came Erev Yom Kippur, and the Kohanim went to that place. Some of them, in fact, he said they collected money, and the Kohanim sat in that area that he forbade them to go. So he realized he had a serious problem, because they were relying on their previous Rav that was Mekel. So he sent to a number of Gedolim, this Kohen, who was not the Mechava Ezrachi, he was the Rav of Lvov, and he sent to a number of Gedolim, amongst them the Eison Ezrachi, to help him to come to halacha l'maisa. So one of the tshuvas, the first tshuva is this Kohen, this Yakov Koppelkatz, the Rav of Lvov. The second one was, Aaron Abba Kohen, Halevi, Aaron Halevi's name was, and he said leaves don't count unless the leaves can support a thin layer of plaster. When you learn the Mishnayos and the Halachos, it has to be Mekabel Maziva. So if it's just leaves that cannot support a thin layer of plaster, and certainly they don't survive the winter, so like many Rishonim, they don't count. So maybe they are right. Maybe if there's not overlapping of real branches, maybe that's why the priest was Mekel. He wasn't getting involved in the specifics, but his ashita was that it has to be leaves that are strong enough to be Makabel Maziva, which the Mishnah is the Mishnah's criterion for maybe Tumah. The Eison Mizrahi himself also was more Mekel regarding leaves. He says it has to survive the winter, otherwise it's not on the halachic map. But the Achron Chav of the fourth and final tshuva in this very long tshuva's Eison Ezrachi was the Taisus Yomtiv, the Grace of Paisik Hadar. And he basically also was Mekel regarding the leaves independently. But his point was that a branch that at any point has a tefach, and typically the branches get smaller, but closest to the stump, any tree, any branch that's at least a tefach has the halachic identity of a oil, and even if the rest of it, even if roiv of it is not a tefach, it is counted. This is the Tshuvas Eison Ezrachi, again a must read, the Minchas Yitzchak, Chelik Dalet, Lamed Aleph, the Shevet Alevi, Ches, Reish Nun Zayin, the B'Tei L'Chochman, Beis, Chav Dalet, all discuss trees. And again, to go through the Rishonim will be more than this year, and we have a big agenda. But as Rav Osner writes in Shevet HaLevi, Sif Cotton Hay of that tshuva, that the average tree is at least suspect to being a maybe Tumah. Again, average tree, I don't mean they planted it last year. These trees, at the first stages, it's not even a tefach of the branch itself, and certainly the leaves don't count if there's no branch. But basically, as he says, pshitu pshita, if you have a tree that's a decent sized tree, and it again gives the perception as one, we have to go at least l'chumrah, and don't forget, we're talking about a suffix yisod deraisa. Now, there are other factors, there are other shitas. Again, you could find rishonim that are mekel, and do not count the leaves. Some are machmir, but all agree, and that's really what the Taisus Yom Tov highlighted, that if the branch is a tefach at one point, even if the rest of it narrows down, that is counted. The truth is, I saw a beautiful description of our Heilige Kohanim, which really applicable to our sugi, because I am not machriya certainly, but the Divrei Chamudos in the halachos ketanas and hilchos Tumah ois chav ches writes the following. He says, I'm not going to waste my time and your time, the reader, reading a sefer, to discuss this question, because Kohanim are medagdik much more than halacha is. Ukamat min hadrachim sheyesh lachshav shemayvi Tumah miyad heim parshim v'yotzim. The Kohanim's reason heim b'chol ki yotzim b'zeh uparshim atzmai b'kol shum safek sheba'olam. In other words, that's a wonderful vote of confidence for our Kohanim. I'm not going to even bother writing halacha because they don't need halacha. They know what they stay away. Kohanim stay away. The truth is, it's a new meaning of Kohanim's reasoning. Wonderful understanding. But this question of a typical tree, again, not just a young tree, but a typical tree, is more than just Kohanim's reason, irrational chumras. According to many shittas, you do count the leaves, and certainly the branches. And again, the way the Malamed L'Hoyel highlights that even the misquoted Drisha, Shach and Taz was only makel by a stray branch, but not a tree that you just look at, I'm on the leaf A, I'm on the branch A, and the mace is branch B. There's another tshuva, also very insightful for our sugya, the tshuva mehava, that was the Talmud Muvik of the Noid of Yehuda, in Siman Pei Tes. He got a letter from his mechutin, Rabbi Yosef Hoik. An interesting problem, and you see how there has to be an attention paid to these sugyas. Someone realized that the Beis HaKnesses, the shul of the city, is off limits for Kohanim when the windows are open. Why? Because there was at a distance from the shul, there was a little plot of land that they buried in the fallen, the stillborns. And over the years, trees grew, and there were trees connecting the Beis HaKvaris all the way and were touching the wall of the shul. Now, if the shul windows closed, the shouldn't be a problem. But if the windows open, the kind of going down during the winter in the shul. So they asked his mechutin, Rabbi Yosef Hoik, if it's a problem. So he said there are a number of sveikis. First of all, you don't know where the Nephilim's kavur begins, and he is mitzdaref anofim and a whole bunch of coolers that he felt it's okay. So he writes back to him like a mechutin has to, respond. Ahuvi yedidi mechutani. I don't know why you find so many coolers. Why do you megabev coolers in a place you have to be machmer? Ma yisun hechshazeh. He says, you have to, and also you have to realize that things are changing. You have to have mashgiach tmidi, not just dismiss the issue. And only and sveikis is not enough. And he writes, I remember growing up that we were constantly cutting trees. And my great Rebbe, the Noid Yehuda, and I quote the lashon, Kama pamim reisi lamoiri sheshalach tekev lekotzitzam. If you have a suffix, cut down the branches. So it wasn't nervin. But it's something vikidashta, the job of the Kohanim and the job of the Israelim to maintain kedushas kuna. So again, things are changing. I mean, you think about that a metzias that we saw in both the Tshuva Meyahava and the Eisen Ezrachi, that you could have a place that one day's muta and years later becomes asa. So that's why Lamaisa, there are other cheshbainis, and I know there are those that are makel in certain cases, but Lamaisa, a kohen that has to travel in a certain area, whether it's here or in the mountains, or wherever the Kohanim are living, It's not so hard to stand at a distance, of course, from the suffix and try to study it. If there's a small tree in the first place, or there's a stray branch, and it's just not connecting any other part of the tree, so the fact that it extends out of the tree is not enough of an issa. Then we have the drisha. But if it's a real tree, a big tree, and there is some type of connection there, then at least the chumrah, we have to be careful. This is typically by a base akvaris of Yidden. There are some bate kvaris that are known to be non-Jewish. The question is, if it's a non-Jewish cemetery, are there any leniencies opposed to a Yiddish? The same shaila, of course, is a hospital, a museum, which the body parts and the mummies, which are typical in a museum, typically not Yidden. So, in Gemara Yevamis, Daf Samach Amud Beis, the very end of the Yamid, quoting Yeshimon Bar Yochai, Kivrei Akum Eina Metamim Ba'oil. That's the sheet of the Heilig of Yeshimon Bar Yochai, and it dashes a pasuk. So it's a very relieving shita. Nothing less than Yeshimon Bar Yochai. But there's more to it, because the Gemara in Yevamis in Kuf Yud Dalid has a Meiser Rav. One of the Amoraim met Rabbi Baravu, met Eliyahu Hanavi in a Beis HaKvaris. And he goes, aren't you a Kohen? What are you doing here? So he says, don't you know the halacha? Yeshimon Bar Yochai, based on a pasuk, says, Kivrei Akum Eina Metamim. So you can't get a better combination than a psak of Yeshimon Bar Yochai and a Meiser Rav Eliyahu Hanavi. The problem is, there's a Mishnah in a halachos. The sheet of Shimon ben Gamliel is that Kivrei Akum are metame, and the pasuk is learned differently. And Tosfos says that the story about Eliyahu, who was just bimdoichem, is another heta. But now we have a machlokes tanoim, Rav Shimon bar Yochai, and Shimon ben Gamliel. And the klali hayra is, we pass like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, b'makom Shimon bar Yochai. And that's why some Rishonim are machmir Kivrei Akum. Tosfos in Bava Kuf Yudalet has that shita. However, the Rosh in the Chuvas, beginning of Flalamid, the Goyis Maimoni in Oval Gimel Beis, and that's the sheet of the Shulchan Aruch. I'll read Lashon Shulchan Aruch, very indicative of the sheet of the Rishonim. In Shin Ayin Beis Siv Beis, Kivrei Akum Nochain Lizar Behem Milei Lechaleim. Don't go on a Keva Akum. There are Moz Lashon Afi Sheyesh Makilan Nochain Lahachmer. So it's pretty rare that you find the Mechaber Ramah both using this mild term of Nochain Lizar, Nochain Lahachmer. But basically, Mitzad Adin, they seem to paskin that Kivrei Akum are not metame. Kivei Eiga and the Pesachei Tshuva quote of a Shava Kohen that we do paskin halacha, not just a chumrah like Shimon Gamliel. And the truth is, that's why Kohanim are machmer even by Kivrei Akum. And that's why if a typical standard museum that has various sveikis or maybe vadoyis, a mummy, yes dvarm bagav, I assume there's something there. That's akum. Body parts. Someone told me they exhibit the lungs of a smoker to show how damaging smoking is. But that's a kazayis of a mace. And typically we have to assume that a decent museum has at least body parts. I mean, could have a museum that's exceptional. I hope the Bar Park Museum is free of these sveikis. But a typical museum has a problem of some type of tumah. And indeed, Kohanim should not go there. It's mutter, but Nochain Lizar, I think, applies to museum. You'll find a different Chalamoy trip. What about if it's a Frayid, a Mummer? Is that a problem? Let's see, driving by a chapel, and in fact in Flappers there's one awning over a chapel, and your mazal is a Levayin in progress. It's a Fraya Yid, but it's a Yid. So even though in certain halachos we might not consider him a Yid because you don't count to a minion according to some, and question of giving aliyah, but regarding our sugya, afi shachata Yisrael, and that's why the Ramah in the end of Shinayim Beis, based on the Rashba, says, Lagabi, this question, all agree, Mumma is a Yisrael. Now that's a Mumma. Certainly a Frayid, a Tenik Shanishba, or that category. So basically, we have a problem now. Because the truth is, the Chachmas Adam, who lived close to 300 years ago, in the Sefer Kufnun Tes Yud Ches, writes that in his times, and Laida, we have this problem much more than he had it. He says, today, in a typical Beis HaKvaros of Goyim, there are Yidden there. Eden that didn't live like Eden and died like not Eden, and never a stam basic verse, you have to suspect there are Eden there. How often and how times do we hear this? People say, I'm not Jewish, my mother's Jewish, but not me. That type of, attitude. So it's a problem, because even what's known as a Goyish basic verse could have Eden. A non-sectarian basic verse that officially has everybody. So of course that's a problem. But what's interesting is that I found probably half a dozen poskim that are makel regarding our question. A tree that overlaps what you know to be a goyish beis akvaros. The Minchas Yitzchak Chelik Dalet Siman Lamed Aleph. Talking about driving, we'll soon see that might be another heta by itself. But the Oznidbru and Chelik Vav Siman Samach, the Minchas Yitzchak Dalet Lamed Aleph, the Bar Tabam Aleph Reish Pei quoting of David Feinstein. They all say that basically, if it's a kohen that's traveling under a branch that's in the other side in a beis akvaros. So if it's at most only a nachan li zoher, so maybe he can't be. Maybe that's his route that he's taking. Of course, if you could avoid it, avoid it. But let's say he's in the middle of driving and he notices that there's a basic forest. He's driving in the mountains and all of a sudden he's realized he's under a tree that overlaps the basic forest. The Marsham in Beis Reish Lamed Gimel, and Kivega quotes it also, a Chavas Das, the Chiddush Nifla, but the Chavas Das was the Chavas Das, the Nesivas, that says that Tumas, that the only chumrah is oil ameis of an akum, but mamshocha micheda lecheda, connecting this conductor, is not a problem. So oibazoi, that comes out that even if it is a vade meis in the beis akvaris, but if it's akum, and a tree at most is a mevi tum, it's not the tumah itself, so you have that to be seimachan. Driving, as opposed to walking, there is another tzad to be makel. And that is the very big sugya, which we once discussed, but was again for us, that there's no doubt about it. La halacha, kohen can be right next to a mace, and it's mutlach atchila, akaponim, in certain cases. Why? Let's say there's a mace in room A, and the kohen's in room B, and it's totally separate. He has the windows closed, there's no peseach tefach, it's not safe for tumalotzes. He's in a safe embassy. If he's in a separate rishus, there's nothing connecting the two. So the kohen could be very close to the mace. I mean, it's just a wall in between, but that's fine. As long as there's no peseach tefach or saif tamalatzes, etc. So the question is, so let's say a kohen is in a plane or in a car. Maybe he's a separate rishus. So even he might be flying over beis akvaros, but let's give the plane the status of a separate oil. And the windows are closed, there's no peseach tefach. So why is he any worse than a kohen that's in one room and there's a mace in the other room? But this, of course, is the well-known sugya of oil zaruk. It's a Mishnah in a halachos, it's a Gemara Nazir and Erevin, other places. But to make a very long story short, we paskin oil zaruk, lo yishmei oil. So it's not independent regarding the transfer of Tumah. And that's why there's no heta per se as far as a kohen being in a plane and not worrying about flying over basic forest because I'm in an oil zaruk. You're right. You're in oil zaruk, but oil zaruk, lo yishmei oil. I mean, it's oichmer and oil that's flying. But what's negeya to us, the Mishnah Melech in Hilchos Tumas Meis, Yud Aleph Hey, has his remarkable chiddush that's when he's flying, or in the Mishnah's case, when there's a bird flying, or a talis, a cloak that's flying in the air. That's oil zaruk, lo yishmei oil. But let's say you're in an oil that's grounded on the ground, let's say in an agola, or today in a car, and it's pretty much grounded in that respect, that it has a certain permanence where it is. Says the Mishnah Melech, maybe that oil zaruk is shmei oil. And the Har Tzvi and Yeridei Reish Pei and the Tzitz Eliezer Yud Beis Samach Beis Varichis say that might apply to today's cars. If there's no peseach tefach, the windows are closed. So even if you say oil zaruk lo yishmei oil, but this is on the ground. But the overwhelming majority of poskim strongly take exception to that. The Rosh and the Helig Chazenish and Yeridei Reish Aleph Ches. The Merkavah Shel Otto spells it out. Ha'iveres al beis hakvaros are not chaytzitzin because that's still an oil zaruk. It's still moving. The fact that it has a little more permanence than flying in the air is not enough to make it an oil. And poik chazi, we don't see Kohanim attending a levaya or beis hakvaros and being in a car with closed windows. I mean, the Rav Pa'olam and Yeridei Chelik Gimel Siman Chav Gimel writes with pain that he once heard of a kohen that went to a beis hakvaros and he said, "I'm oil zarek," and he basically said, "You can't do that because we don't rely on that regarding an agola." And today's kaza is a perfect example. But, and here's what the big but, the poskim do add, if a person's driving, and the worst scenario, it's a beis hakvaros of an akum, and the tree situation is not known to him, so then you can continue driving. You have enough starting to be makel. Not that we're megabev kulis, but again, we don't do things lechatchila, but this is enough to allow the kohen to drive, of course, as quick as he can out and avoid the sveikis. But these three sveikis sort of combine to make a sort of a shtickle of a kula in the case where a person's out of town, and we could say typically roiv oilam is goyim and roiv mesim are goyim. So an unidentifiable beis hakvaros you could assume to be goyish. So he's driving and the tree is not sure what the status of the tree is, and also the oil zarek lights some. Now, the truth is that's part of the zechus of being a kohen, to know your roots. When you see it once, okay, the next time figure it out, the status of it. Again, you don't have to be a yodin if you just know how to study trees and see the situation of it. But basically, this is the yisoid. The other question that I mentioned about a bus driver, so the truth is, stam buses, especially during the summer, the windows are open. So it wouldn't be an oil zarek even like the makilim, and to get all the boys to close the windows is not going to happen. So really, if he's going under a tree that overlaps a Yiddish beis hakvaros, even if he has children, might even be an Issa D'Oraisa on the Yisrael, because that would be Emor v'Amarta, that's Safin and Biyadayim. I saw an interesting question where a kohen is driving, and he stays away from beis hakvaros and trees. He's in a tunnel, and his mazel, there's a hearse that pulls up side by side. What do you do now? So this is oil zarek at best, but it's still not better than oil zarek that we say lo yishmei oil. He's not in an embassy for himself. So someone said, I would just step on the gas. That's dangerous. It's not yarg v'yavor. And the issa was going into oil, not just finding yourself in the oil. So we don't do dangerous things, that's for sure. But here we have one possible heta, if he closes the windows quickly. So you have at least the oil zarek eitzah. The only eitzah is to drive out quickly. Safely quickly, that is, because there's nothing to do. To jump out of the car is suicide, and also it's worse because you lose the head of oil zarek. You don't gain anything. You're still in the same oil. The tunnel's one big oil. Now, if it's a goyish hearse, so you have another tzad, that the meis akum is only metame b'maga masa and not ba'oil. Rav Ozna has this shaila, in Chelik Gimel Kuf and Gimel. It's hard to know the situation, but he says I think what he's talking about is not a gay here. He paid his toll, for example. He's about to go into the tunnel, and this is a hearse pulling into the tunnel. So he should not go in, he should back out. I lose his money, but Lamaisa, hefsid money is not a heta to Mikhamal Lamaisim, even though it's a guy, but that's a cost and a bissel to be a kohen. Now, in our times, you can't back up in a tunnel, that's dangerous. So it has to be a case that he says that, and maybe a big fine, you don't have to incur to avoid Tumas Kohanim. Now, of course, what he means to say is if it's a Yiddish hearse, and is not the head of Tumas Akum, then maybe, if he backs out and he'll get a big hefty ticket, so that's part of the privilege of being a kohen. Because there's no, it's pashtis, alav, and kol mamayne, some say even for the Rabbanan. Now, so if you know in advance, but again, typically I don't think you could back up, buys a ticket, they might arrest the person. What? Oh yeah? Okay, well. So basically that's the yisoid. Not reckless, Rav Ozna writes, I feel the sofi v'kuach nefesh, pshita, v'chayiv. But if it's just a question of mominus, that a person should know the difference of yid and a goy. Someone asked me, he's driving, minding his own business, and he looks up he stopped for a red light, and there's a hearse pulls up next to him, and the street light is the Mevi Tumah from his car from the hearse to his car. So same idea. This is, if his windows are closed, this would be an oil zarek, and if you notice that it's a goyish hearse, so you have those heterim, and the question is, what's your option? Just to pull out dangerously is definitely not an eitzah, but maybe Taki, if he sees a Yiddish hearse and he's a little of an aggressive fellow, he'll jump the light when it's not dangerous, of course. I'm talking when it's not dangerous. So if I get a ticket, no, it's on the house. Bershtam will appreciate that zehirus. The other question, which is really a beautiful sugya, but the dental implant, you should know, the mitzias is that typically they used to use for dental implants, that's for dentures or teeth that are put in on a permanent basis, they used to use the crushed bones from the animals. But after the mad cow epidemic, it's all humans. Now, whether you like it or not, I don't want to, tell you the bad news, but that's the mitzias. The question is not the mitzias. The question only is that if it's a goyisha bones that it comes from, so it's not even a heta, because true, kivrei Yakov not matama, but oil, but maga and masa it is. So the Kohein is carrying that remains in his mouth. So it's not even the heta of akum. But the point that Rabbi Yashiv, and there's a beautiful sefer that has many shilos negei to Tumas Kohanim and Tziyuni halacha, very reliable from his Talmud, on Mekuf Pei Dalid, he was emphatic about it. And he said that since that the bones were crushed into sizes smaller than a kesa'ira, because the Tumas is a kazayis from basa, but from bones sa'ira, it was made less than a sa'ira, and so it has a halacha of kemach ba'alma, and doesn't regain its status even if it's put together to a size bigger than the sa'ira. And he says, mutu l'chatchila, and he says, I don't know what they say in my name, but that's what I'm telling you, mutu l'chatchila. So that's relieving, that would not be a problem. But what's really a little of an issue is the last part of the sugya, and that is a kohen visiting a hospital. Now, the truth is, we could definitely say that malach kohen bebeis hacholim. The mitzias is that, healthy people don't usually stay in hospitals. There's always a concern of a person dying, or maybe died already. Minimally, there are nefalim, there are body parts, I don't want to get into details, but with any research, there are autopsies, especially if there's a pathology that has body parts, kazesim. There are certainly university hospitals that are affiliated and are constantly teaching and learning. So it's almost a muhzik that there is some tumah that a kohen has to avoid. That's mitzad echad. But then again, the question is, if there's a need, he has his father's in the hospital, and he has to go visit his father. So the fact that it's a mitzvah in itself is not a heta. Chazal have a special term that's called mitzvah b'aveira. Can't do a mitzvah b'makam aveira. That's pashut. The question is a more fundamental one. Because as I told you earlier, even if there's a mace in the building, a kohen could be in a separate embassy in his room with no peiseach tefach, and it's fine. So this is the uniqueness of a hospital in this respect. The truth is, most poskim say that a big hospital, especially a goyisha hospital, is almost a vadai that there's a mace or halachic mace, tefach, or whatever. But the question is, going to visit, if I go carefully, who said I'm going to enter in the oil mace? Pathology is typically in the bottom, then walks in the bottom floor. What does that have to do with the kohen? But the question is, you never know. Now this, I want to tell you, I'm in yeshiva, and I have a little experience with this. I heard from 3 different Kohanim, all Kohanim, they had to visit grandparents, they had a heta, go in, go out, and they found out before there's no mason, and walking out, 3 Bachim told me over the years that right next to them they're wheeling out a mace. Now, it's not the hospital's fault. I'll tell you whose fault it is, and it's not Lashon Hara. You know whose fault it is? The Malach HaMavis. Because, the hospital can be very careful, but if someone dies, what are you supposed to do? Now, typically they keep their more critical patients in a different floor. Everything is fine. But Lamaisa, it happened. And it happened, I know, 3 times over the years. So no one could guarantee anything. But, again, typically a kohen could go and come and not come into a problem of being in the same halachic oil. Yes, the same hospital, the same building, but that really is irrelevant for our sugya. So the shaila is it tzveika deraisa l'chumra? You might end up in a hole with a mace. Or do we say that that's unreasonable? Because there's a big sugya in Shas of Safik Tumah b'shis harabim is mutter. And a hospital has the status of b'shis harabim. So there's a beautiful discussion, Rabbi Yashiv and the Tziyuni halacha on Kuf Lamed Zayin and on, a very thorough discussion. But basically he says if there's a real Safik, then we don't say Safik Tumah b'shis harabim, we say Sfeik Derais L'chumra. And that's his klal, as many others say, that basically regarding air travel, right? They're not officially flying over a base of kvaras, but you don't know what they're flying over. It might be flying over Levaya. There's always the imagination what will be. And again, 6 poskim say that that's Safik to Mushrab, and don't worry about it. So it's more than statistics. The question is, how much of a chance is it that you could go and come safely and avoid it? Now, once you reduced it to a decent suffix, then you have a sugya in Shas, because the very famous sugya of the base Tumah bebeis hapras, which is basically a place that there was mesim, the area was plowed, so it's a suffix Tumah. The Chazal were goyza midrabanan. The Shulchan Aruch in Shin Ayin Beis Aleph quotes that, and that is Heta Tumah b'makom mitzvah. That's the Mechaber's title. In other words, it's a suffix d'Rabbanan, and Chazal made an issa of Beis HaPras, but Makom Mitzvah is mutter. Oh, so now we have not Yilad Mitama Mesim Makom Mitzvah, but if it's a suffix d'Rabbanan, there had the Makom Mitzvah. So the question, when is this applicable to our shilas? So again, I can only tell you what I found. The first one that discusses this is the Chura Shai. It was the Rav in Sigit. It was printed in 1905 in Misparam. And it's hard to understand, but it seemed that it was, he writes, a big hospital that do a Vadei Meisa Yisrael B'chol Yoim. I don't know, maybe Sigurd had their own hospital, but it was a Vadei Meisa Yisrael. I'm not talking about Bellevue Hospital, that's Goyim. Vadei Meisa Yisrael B'chol Yoim. So he says that you have to be Mavara, a Kohen that has to go visit a parent, let's say, and it's a Makkah Mitzvah Kibbut Av and Chizik the parents. So first you have to send a scout to know what's doing. And then he says, if you can't be Mavara, Ein lemnoya, because of the mitzvah b'kecholim. And he goes like almost a about face. Now, I didn't understand it at first, because you tell me this Vadei Meisi Yisrael. So why you also make a mitzvah? But then I realized, like I told you earlier, having a mace in the hospital does not mean that you, Kohen, will encounter an oil hameis. If you go, and we'll soon see how to go, but if you go in the safest course of action, you could avoid being in the same oil of the mace, even if there is a mace. But this one I can tell you what I saw. Again, the information is very brief, but that's what he says. Rab Shlomo Zalman in Mincha Shlomo Tinyana Kuf Ois Ches quotes the Marcheshes, which Rabbi Yashiv also does, very lamdish Marcheshes, that even if Safik Tumas Ram is mutter, that's only the lav of Lo Yitame, but he's oim the lav of Lo Yavoi. So that's really neutralized the heta of Safik Tumas Ram. But then he comes to this question of visiting someone in the hospital, and he says, well, a Kohen can go into base goisis because of a suffix. No, here it's a Yiddish hospital in Eretz Yisrael, where there's Vadei Meisi Yisrael. So he says it's Kavua Meisim, but he also says that even in the room where you're visiting the Chayla, maybe the window's open, maybe Tumalot says, so you have to be careful not to go into Batei Chaylim Gedolim Eretz Yisrael, Lekayim Mitzvahs B'Kechaylim. That's his lashon. Then after that he had B'Shura Shai, hold his mutter to go in when you have no other choice. So again, the Karalam HaKaralam, but again I think it's the same Yisoid. If there's a Vadei Meis Yisrael, that's a Vadei Meis Yisrael. But the Kohen can go carefully and hope for the best. What are the chances that he's going to have the experience that my Baruchim had, that he met a Kohen, met a Meis in the hall? It's a chance, but it's a very remote chance. That's Sveika Lahakal, Makom Mitzvah. But the third is Rav Moshe in Yeridei Beis Kuf Samach Vav, where they asked about, and this is a bit of information that we have to know because this is really very often the American scene, not Sigit or Eretz Yisrael, a hospital that's Roiv Akum. And typically most hospitals, except for our local hospitals, but most hospitals are definitely Roiv Akum. So Rav Moshe says that to be Choyshish, maybe it's a Yid, you don't have to be Choyshish. Roiv Oilam is Goyim and Roiv Meisim are Goyim. He says, but Lamaisa, we stay away from Akum also. That's the Nachal Nizar. And Rav Moshe is often misquoted, Rav Moshe is Mekel, Chas v'Shalom. He writes twice the Lashon, Tzoyer Gadol, or Tzari HaGadol. The Kohen's allowed to go to a hospital that's Roiv Akum. Not Stam, it's Mutter. Again, the Lashon, Tzoyer Gadol, you could be Mekel, and Tzari Gadol, the Chayla, who Aviv, that's expecting his visit. That's Rav Moshe's Lashon. Now he says, when try to be Mavara at first. But again, the point is that the bottom line is a Kohen could go in carefully and reduce it to a very minimal suffix. This is why Lamaisa in America, and Chutzlars I should say, absent a few hospitals, we could assume it's Roiv Akum. Now, the truth is that Rav Ozna in Chelikei Kuf Pei Dalid is also making a mitzvah, but he comes from a different angle, and he says, typically it's not even a mitzvah b'kecholim. and he quotes the Ramah and Shin Lamed Hey based on a Ramban, that if a person went to Vakachayla and didn't daven for the Chayla, loy kiyam ha-mitzvah. Integral part likuva bikachaylam is davening for the Chayla. And then he says, but very often it's not bikachaylam, it's a social visit. He said, that's really my problem. It's not really makkah mitzvah. It's not necessary. And Rav Moshe said the same thing. And Rapam avoided going to a hospital because he would go sometimes to the hospital, stay on the outside and wave to the chayla and sometimes communicate when possible. Because, very often it's the show of confidence, the show of care. A phone call sometimes could replace that, or a nice gift, a thoughtful gift. It's very hard to give klolim. I will just tell you what Rav Vosna says, that basically his point is that if you can reduce the chance by going in a proper way, b'makom tzoyrech, it's mutter. But again, he says, avoid going if it can be avoided. Rabbi Yashiv's the nusach is pachas levake and yoisel lekatza. Minimize the visits and shorten the visits that you do go. Rav Vosna says something, and you have to take it with a grain of salt, but he says, go visit the Yoledis, the Kohen's wife had a baby, and afterwards go run to the hospital. Who said that's necessary? She's not critically ill, chas v'shalom, it's a simcha. And if it's a day and a half that, she won't have a visitor, now I'm afraid to say this, some people's wives will not be moichel them. But the story there that I want to point out, Rav Yashiv in the Tzuni halacha Kufnan Daled, where someone's wife, Kohen's wife suffered a miscarriage. And he wanted to visit her at night when there's no problem of the nafel being in the vicinity. So Rabbi Yashiv says, what's up? Give her a call. So on the bottom, they write that Rabbi Yashiv knew the Kohen and knew the wife, and she would be satisfied with the phone call. And they quote the Berkei Yosef's precious lashon in the end of Shin Tzad the Gimel, a shayla you have to be sheikel b'shekel HaKodesh. Some wives are proud to be Eishes Kohanim, and they're moichel to visit. A person's deathly ill, they need visitors, but a simcha, everybody's bringing flowers and everything, so they wait a day and a half. So approach with caution at your own understanding. Each shayla is different, b'shekel HaKodesh, bringing the younger brother of the newborn. If the newborn's a kohen, obviously the brother's also a kohen. That could be a violation of Emar V'Amarta. Now, basically, when a parent is sick, it's a very different story. A parent needs a child, and there's no one that can replace a child. And the parent needs the child, and the child has to be there, even at a longer visit. So that's his place. Then that we have to say that this is something that you have to have a little that shekel HaKodesh. Now, a few practical tips how to do it and avoid, or at least to minimize, reduce the concerns. There's no doubt about it that being in the same building or the same floor in itself is not tamei. It's basically being in the same rishus or in the same area where there's a peseach tefach. So when a kohen has to decide b'shekel HaKodesh, he has to visit someone in the hospital. Step one, try to be mevar. Some hospitals are more friendly than other ones, but try to be mevar. What's doing on this floor? What's doing in the lobby? Send a scout, a non-kohen ahead of you is a good idea. Then typically travel by stairway, not elevators. Elevators has the problem of you might need a mace there, obviously, because they don't bring mason in stairways. Also, safe to malotzeis is a very big factor. So if you know that his coast is clear on the ground floor, and it's possible, of course, it's not a very, very high climb, go by stairway. That eliminates another problem. And when you get to the chayla's room, close the door. They might give you a hard time, so you try to explain for religious purpose, you have to keep the door closed. Windows are no longer, find windows in hospitals anyhow, but basically try to keep the room without a peseach tefach. If the parent needs something, so if you get a nurse to bring it, you call, or if you have a daughter, she could go, but try to avoid going in the halls unnecessarily, because that's where either sefer tamalotzeis, or more so, it could be just happen to be one of these minority situations that a mace is wheeled out. And again, no one could promise you. It's not shaykh. It's again the Malach HaMavos decision. The Baruch decision, but Malach HaMavos is the one that makes the trouble. So basically, check and go, stay in the room, and before you leave again, if it's shaykh to have a scout going ahead, go the quickest route to the staircase and go down, and when you get downstairs again, try to see what's doing and go out as quick as possible. The basic point is the shorter the visit, the better, because that relieves or eliminates some of the concern what will be. Now, all of this would be mutter even b'makom that there's mason in the building, because again, the fact in the ground floor or the pathology is nothing to do with the chayla and his rooms. The real issue is you might just meet a mace in the hall itself. That's a small suffix, and that's what the bika chaylim had to, and of course make sure to daven for the chayla. Now a parent that's sick, the child can't run out after a 5-minute visit, so use the shekel HaKodesh and habolataya, certainly Messiah noisy. Someone asked me, he's a Kohen, his wife is an Ashes Kohen, and he was told she cannot go to Levaya because she's muberes, she's expecting, and someone told him that she can't go to Levayas or Beis HaKvaros. Now this seems to be contrary to what we began with, the Rekeach. The Rekeach said an Ashes Kohen, muberes, could go into an oil hames. But the problem, he said, was that his wife took a ultrasound and they determined the gender of the child, and now it's no longer a svek sveka, it's a zacha. Now, hopefully he's not hoping for the following, so what's the heta? So the embassies, Rabbi Yanka Fisher, Chelik Ches Ayin Zayin writes that you don't trust these ultrasounds, they're wrong, and he writes stories, some horrible stories about people told that the child is born without a head. I don't know how even the story was, but that's what he has there, and it was not true, and the deformity, we don't trust ultrasounds. But the emes is, even if you do have a reason to believe that it's going to be a zachar, there's a whole other factor to consider, and that's the Magen Avram and Shin Mem Gimel, Archaim, who wonders, why does Rekeach have to have a het of svek sveka? Why don't we say that even if it's a zachar guaranteed, it's a tara balua. It's in the embassy of its mother, and that's enough of a het, even if it's not a svek sveka. Plus, Rav Shlomo Zalman, this is quoted in the Mincha Shlomo Chelik Bey, Simon Tzadik Vav. He says, let's say you don't come onto the het of tara balua. But what is the status of an unborn baby? Is he a din kahuna? Is it ish? V'loi uber? Who told you it's considered a kohen? Now this, of course, puts a question mark on the whole rekeach, that is only talking she might deliver in the oil hames, and then the baby is born. It's a baby. That's the problem. And that's why typically a muberes has no problem being in a oil hames mamish. However, the Yavitz in Chelik Beis, Kuf Ayin Zayin, he says there's a mokum chashiv to be concerned that in the 9th month, when she's oimid laledes mamish, not to go in the oil hames. It might happen. And I saw other poskim say that, so we have to qualify that it's only in the 9th month is a problem of muberes being in oil hames. But then I saw the Minchas Yitzchak Chelik Yud Simon Mem Beis, where someone asked him this question, and he said there's a minig that any muberes not go into oil hames, even a Yisrael. And it's very relieving, it's a breath of fresh air. We're talking about Mason. He says the Mishnah says in Parah, Gimel Mishnah Beis, they had to shep the water for the mayim of the Parah, and they had to have special Yisraelim that were brought up b'tahara. There's no shchash tumah. And women looked for the opportunity to have that child. So he wants to say that that's why the minig was that muberes stayed away from oil hames even anytime, even Yisraelis. She had the emunah, Meher Yavai Mashiach, and she wants to have a child that's Halik. Okay, that's a minik. Some Bechlal have a minik to keep muberes out of Beis HaKvaros. That's Tumah, but it's the Ruach Ra. But let me leave you with another beautiful ha'ora, a Kohen, one of those wonderful Malachi Rachmim who works for Hatzalah. And he told me once, I guess in jest, but he said he ran to a call, and the person, I think he said coded, that's the word he said, but the person was stopped breathing. He's considered clinically dead. So he revived him, he was able to revive him, and he felt great about himself, that he was Mechayah Mason. He said, oh, what did I do? I was in the oil of a mace. So I told him he made it to a Toises. Toises in our Sugya, in Kuf Yud Daled, asked the question, how is Eliyahu Navi allowed to be Mechayah, the child, in Malachim Aleph, Perik Yud Zayin? Eliyahu was a Kohen. So Toises answers, because Eliyahu was Batuach, he could do it, and therefore it's Bikuach Nefesh. So I said, that's one heta, but the real heta between me and you is, you are Mechayah Mason. I mean, you're a great person, but you're not Mechayah Mason. Varaya, the person doesn't have to have a new kedushin, that as if he was reborn again. So basically, it's just that he brought him a little more chiyas, and hopefully we'll have those type of ha'oras. I wouldn't talk to you. Go ahead.
Shem Egan Shirtel like to be a shikar to Smith. Today's share would like to give a big shikar to Mishpachas Weiss is sponsoring today's share. The zechus is sponsoring a share called Egan Shirtel 718-851. 8651 or email ist@yeshivanet.com. Bezos Hashem after Mincha, Rav Smith will say a sikkim of today's shir. Kohanim ben Akash Yemel Tzakadosh Baruch Hu L'Zakas Yisrael. Fik Behevel Torah Mitzvah Shnei Malon Echofes and Mantzit Geyagol Torah V'Yader.